beginning, God created relationships between God and angels, God and man, and between all of us. Through the love of God and the peace of Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, we are all interconnected. Come join Pastor Penny Schulz and Kristen as scholars, counselors, travelers through the Holy Land, and warriors in Christ, while they explore the fascinating, the difficult, the obscurities, the oddities, and the hope of God's holy word. They will discuss what those scriptures mean to us and how living in the Spirit changes everything.
Hello, and welcome to
Live Life in the Spirit.
If you are tuning in for the first time, we are so glad you're joining us. We are your hosts. I am Kristen Scherenberg.
And I am Pastor Penny Schulz.
We promise some joy, some inspiration, and interesting, intriguing, out-of-the-box thinking. You can go back and watch or listen to our previous podcasts on YouTube, on Rumble, or on the various other podcast feeds like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iTunes, and many others. Or you can go to our website. You can click on the tab of your choice, and that will take you directly to the podcast, or the blogs.
Well, this is a place where we are daring enough to tackle the tough issues that we face on a daily basis, ranging from the spiritual to the supernatural. If you have ever sat in church your whole life, or have read the Bible faithfully many times, and still find yourself saying, "I've never heard that before," well, this is the place for you. We will dive into those very obscure, interesting passages, all while bringing to light why they're so important.
Because once you know, you can't unknow. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to introduce ourselves.
Kristen has been working in the mental health field for 15 years. She has her work cut out ever since she met me. And she is definitely not the one you want to take to a don't laugh situation.
Oh. So Penny started out in the medical field, and then God moved her into the ministry over 24 years ago. She's been shepherding the lost ever since, and she's definitely had her work cut out for her since meeting me.
Well, last week we looked at the who is causing the chaos in our nation, the principalities behind all the evil. We focused on Baal, the possessor. He is the most ancient god going back to the beginning in Mesopotamia, Canaanite. He's called El, he's called Baal, Greek Zeus, Roman Jupiter, Egyptian Osiris, Kronos, Marduk. List goes on, but it's still the same entity. We see in 1 Kings chapter 12, right away there in verse 26, we see that it was Jeroboam the first who changed the true worship of God. He changed the feast, he replaced the Sabbath, and he replaced God with the golden calves in Bethel and Dan.
Right.
And we know that even Solomon was influenced by his many wives and from various nations who brought with them their gods and their idols. And one in particular, Baal, who Solomon built a temple in the high place right there on the Mount of Olives. And we stood basically
right on that spot.
In that spot, yeah.
So we talked, and we will be talking, that we need to keep in mind from Ephesians 6:12, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the rulers of darkness of this age, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places.
Well, that is why he is called the possessor. He's the first of that dark trinity. He just needs an opening in the door of a nation, a heart, a church, you name it, and he comes in and he sets up camp.
Absolutely.
Now, the next one we're going to explore today is the enchantress, or the seductress. She is the one who lures with pleasure of all types, anything to distract or enslave. She is the goddess Ashtoreth. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in all forms, from Ashtoreth singular to Ashtaroth, which is plural. There's many statues of it. Or Ashtaroth is ultimately derived in the 2nd millennium BC from the Phoenician goddess Astarte. Mm-hmm. So like Baal, Ashtoreth has many names, but the same entity. So the equivalent would be the Babylonian god Ishtar, which is the same as Astarte, or earlier Sumerian Inanna. So many of you have heard any of these names. They sound familiar. They are in some in the Bible. Others from
just different mythology. Yep.
There is also another name that maybe we don't think of and we don't equate, and that is Isis.
Yes.
Now, why I bring that up is because when I was growing up as a kid, I didn't know any of these names. It didn't make any difference to me. But there was one name that I was very familiar with, and that was Isis, because I watched Saturday morning cartoons. And towards the end of that, when Mom started vacuuming after she had given us enough time to watch, then it was the People cartoons that were actual actors. And Shazam was on, and after Shazam was Isis.
I didn't watch that.
You were too young for that.
Might have been.
Well, Isis was on, and the interesting thing was they had glamorized her. Oh, she was definitely Wonder Woman. I mean, in her attire, what she wore, a lot of attributes like Wonder Woman, really. The golden lasso and the bracelets, and all that kind of stuff. But as a kid, I grew up thinking she was so cool. I wanted to be just like her because she had superpowers.
Right.
Getting that little toehold in the door, and that was in the 70s.
Right.
Mid to later 70s. Well, she is also known, if you haven't heard those names, I bet you've heard this one, Aphrodite or Venus. She's the queen of heaven. Well, not in our heaven,
right,
but in mythology, heaven. And
the queen of
she went down into the underworld and she took over there too. So she, in her mind, she's queen of both realms. She is one of the nastiest. She causes war, dissension, and has been worshipped as one of the biggest fertility gods, besides Baal. She is the only gender fluid god who's both female and male, which is very interesting. She comes up more as a woman, but she plays both sides. She is the goddess of sexuality and the distortion thereof.
So she is one that they had, when they were worshiping her, they actually had temple prostitutes, and she would often take on that form herself. It sounds odd, but in the pagan world, it was a regular part of their worship experience. You went and found a temple prostitute, and
that was part of your worship. This is really interesting. Most people don't realize that, but we see it starts clear back in actually Genesis, from the beginning in Genesis 38. If you remember Judah and Tamar, he had a daughter-in-law that he refused to give his son to after his other son had died. And so he was, okay, this is Judah, right? He's part of it, Hebrew, Jewish community, worshiping God. And yet he was going to the temple prostitute. That was part of their worship. They would go and they would ask for sacrifice, or they would want something from God, good harvest, good whatever. So they were mixing. They were worshiping God, but they were bringing in some of those pagan traditions.
Right.
And so he and Tamar, knowing this is the kicker of this story. Most people don't understand this. Go back and read Genesis 38. Tamar should have been given to his younger son. He refused. And so to carry on the lineage of his older son, she needed to be pregnant and she needed to have a child. And since he was refusing to do his duty, for us the culture sounds really weird, but so knowing that he would go, so this was a weekly thing or a monthly thing, she stood along the side dressed as though she was a temple prostitute. Him seeing her and not knowing it was Tamar, that's exactly what happened, and she becomes pregnant. So I want you to go back and read that. So when you do, now this is going to make so much more sense, and why when she ends up becoming pregnant and he wants to kill her and she goes, well, the owner of this is the father and it's his. There's that
moment where he's like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble.
But it's the moment that he goes, you are better than I. You think of that and you go, what? Wait a minute. She just tricked him and had a baby with him, but he did not fulfill his duty from the beginning.
Right, which in their culture was...
That was big.
It wasn't big.
It was very big.
It's hard for me to even wrap my brain around.
I know, it is.
It's an odd tradition, but it was an important part of all of it.
Well, because sons would die and then they had no one to carry on their legacy. And so a brother would take that spot. There's a couple other passages that, if you know that, then the passages make sense. But then we'll jump to Deuteronomy with Moses. In Deuteronomy 23, Moses is telling the people of Israel, because this is still going on. He says, people of Israel, don't let any of you ever be temple prostitutes. Well, if it didn't exist, why is it in the Bible?
Right.
Says the Lord your God is disgusted with men and women. See, not just women,
but
it was also men. Who are prostitutes of any kind, and he will not accept a gift from them, even it has been promised to him. That was the whole mindset. Like I said, you would go and you would give a gift that was going to the gods, but through this act, and God saying, no, that's not what I want. And also we see from Joshua, and now this is a famous one that most people don't realize. They've heard of Rahab. This is after then Moses and Joshua is coming in and he's spying out the land, and he sends his 2 spies in, and they climb up to the window of one woman. And who was she?
She was a temple prostitute.
Rahab. Well, we don't know that she's a temple prostitute. Most people don't realize it. It just says she was a prostitute.
Oh, I think I added the temple because I've just heard it that way so many times.
Because that's the way I talk about it. But most people don't. They just think she was a prostitute, like that was her job. She was actually in Jericho, that pagan time culture. It was considered sacred. A whole different concept. But now you have the spies of Joshua and Nun, that are coming in, and they meet her and they're telling her there's a better way, and she's heard about God. And she gives up that lifestyle.
Sure.
Ends up marrying one of those spies, who then later becomes the father of Boaz, which is kind of cool. But we don't think about that.
No.
And then in Job 36.
So he's admonishing the actions of ignorant youth, and their life perishes among the cult prostitutes.
So it's just another reference that it is there. It's throughout all of the scriptures.
Right.
And in fact, we can bring it all the way up then to Paul. Paul has the most to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. He admonishes the Christians that are in Corinth for their casual attitude towards sexual sin. Now, why would the Corinthians have that casual attitude? Because it was part of their culture for years and years and years. Specifically, though, Paul is calling out those who solicit prostitutes.
Right.
And he's not talking about the prostitutes, he's talking about those who are seeking them out, and this is the Christians. Because they were trying to bring in that pagan culture, that pagan tradition.
Right.
So they're like going, oh, we are on fire for Christ, we love this new concept, we love this new religion, but we kind of miss some of that stuff. Let's bring it in and add it to our repertoire. And Paul's saying, no. You have to deny yourself. You have to become a new creation.
Right.
And let all that go.
Well, a lot of scholars have taken that admonition a step further and said that Paul was specifically condemning sacred prostitution, like you talked about, associated with Corinth's famous temple to the goddess Aphrodite.
Yep.
Right in there. Sacred prostitution was commonly practiced in the temples of Aphrodite and Venus, her Roman equivalent.
Yeah. So, again, same entity, just different names depending on the culture.
Right. So the entity behind all those, same thing.
Well, this week I decided to wear this shirt.
And I don't have that one yet.
Which is from The Chosen. But it says, this is when Jesus was healing the man at the Bethesda pool. He says, sometimes you got to just stir up the waters. And that's what we're looking at today.
That's right.
Even then, we're in Jerusalem, but if you know that whole story of the pool of Bethesda, that was not a Hebrew pool.
No.
It was a Roman pool that actually they believed that the angel, it wasn't the angel of God, they believed that it was an angel of probably Aphrodite or Venus came down and would touch the pool and then they would be healed. Problem was nobody was healed. It was just the thought. It was what they put their hope into. And so when Jesus comes and he sees this man, first of all, he's a Jew laying by a pagan pool. And he goes, why? What, have you fallen that far out of hope that you're willing to put your hope in something that doesn't even exist? That was huge. You see right there that there was a tug of war between the two cultures, even in Jesus' time.
Absolutely.
And Jesus gives him hope. The waters were not stirred up in the pool, but he stirred up the waters in this man's heart.
Oh, absolutely.
And he says, do you want to be healed? And it's at that point, when that stirring happens, that he says yes, that he is healed.
Stand.
And he shows everybody that his God is far more powerful than the gods
that was healing people.
that was not.
That's right.
Yeah. So today, we're probably going to be stirring up the waters quite a bit
That's
with
right.
what we're going to be talking about. But by the time we get done, hopefully you will also come to the same conclusion of the hope and the power in the God that we serve,
That's right.
who is even stirring up the waters in this society right now, whether you realize it or not. Well, last week we said that when the gospel message came forth, the demons left,
Right.
just in the power of the name of Jesus.
Right.
Jesus literally drove them out. And so a lot of these temples then, the entities were gone.
Right.
It was bare, but the people were still doing the same practices.
Sure. And as we talked about last week, America was founded on Christ. And so it had been a nation under God, Adonai. And we were blessed as a nation, not just the people. You know, and there continues to be a link between the gods and the cultures that follow them, and then the culture becomes possessed. So part of pagan worship was foaming at the mouth and loss of control, and you would see that in possession, and then you can see that as a civilization becomes possessed. So even now, same thing that we talked about, what happens if the gospel leaves? Then the return of the gods, they come back.
Right. So that's what we looked at in Matthew 12:43. It says, when an unclean spirit has gone out of the person, so we'll take Rome or Greece, okay? The gospel message came in and drove it out. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it wanders through the waterless regions looking for resting place but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds it empty, swept, and put in order. And then it goes and brings along 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they enter and live there. And the last state of that person is far worse than the first. So it will be with this evil generation. So as I said, when we were doing this, it wasn't just about a person. It can be a person, but it can also be, that last little tagline can be a culture, a nation. So what's worse? A nation who never knew God and then knows God, or a nation who knew God, left God?
Right. Let's go with option B, is worse.
When we abandon God is when the signs of the specific gods really came in. And we looked at that last week, because it will be filled with something.
Right.
America was a Christian nation, and now we're being transformed into a pagan one. Even President Obama said that America was no longer a Christian nation. So very powerful spirits that are back is because we have made room for them. We've opened up the door.
Absolutely.
Last week we looked at
The possessor.
Yeah.
So we looked at Baal, Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, Osiris, Kronos, Enlil, Qumrabi,
Marduk, Kronos. Those are all his names, same guy. So this week we're looking at the enchantress, Ashtoreth, Ishtar, Isis, Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, Isis.
You name it, we got it all.
And next week we'll look at
The destroyer,
which is
Molech.
That makes up the dark trinity. Of course,
That's what evil does.
he does. It has to mimic.
It mimics everything that Christ did, everything that God did, and they try to take it and make it theirs, but they make it bad.
Well, we see in Judges, actually, to prove that these entities exist, that these gods have been around for a long time.
Right.
A lot of people don't connect the dots and the pieces of the puzzle together through the Bible. But if you've read in even Judges, it says we see the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, which Or they'd put up the poles. If you read about that, they were constantly setting up high places, which would be temples or altars, or Ashtoreth poles.
Right.
That was for Ashtoreth, which was a fertility pole. Totem poles can be the same thing.
Oh, for sure.
And then for Samuel, when the people realized the consequences of their obedience, then they cried out to the Lord and said, "We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths."
Right.
So it wasn't until they got the consequences that they were sorry about it.
That happens.
You're a mom of kids,
I
too.
am. That happens a lot. Oh, I'm in trouble. I should have maybe not done that. I'm so sorry.
The enchantress is, some look at her as the wife of Baal, the Canaanite mythology. But we see that she is mostly the goddess of sexual immorality.
Yes.
So if America were to turn their back on God, as we looked last week, and shove God out,
Right.
that opens the door for what?
Something else to come in.
And what did we see? That all happened in the 60s, and what else happened in the 60s?
The sexual revolution.
Right. It was a paganization of the culture through sexuality, overturning 2,000 years of biblical values. It becomes normalized, only she pushes it up a whole nother notch.
Yes. In ancient times, she caused images of naked women and pottery and statues all over. She was the prostitute goddess. She destroyed marriage. Look what's happened. Pornography was in the writings of the prostitute. The earliest pornography literature comes from her. We see an explosion of pornography, and I would say that's definitely something we have seen.
Oh, it's huge.
Out of control.
And it started out as something that was hidden, and now it has been in your face.
Oh yeah, you can find it on practically any platform. Your kids can look for something for school and they're finding stuff that they're not supposed to. It's bad.
And it's free.
Yep.
Anything that's wicked and evil is free. She's the goddess of the occult and spells. A lot of people don't realize that. And in 1960, we had the explosion of what? Occults, witchcraft, Wicca. And now Wicca has been what? It has been glamorous. In fact, they've changed it and watered it down to where, we don't do all that. We just, we're
It's all about nature.
Yeah, if you've looked at any of their literature, by the third page, they're already telling you how to make your own spell book and how to make your own little box to put your wand in or whatever. Don't be deceived.
Right.
It's not benign by any means.
Right.
Yeah, I think back to as a kid, the reruns of as harmless as Bewitched. I mean, that's what my mom grew up on. Bewitched, this seems so... I mean, she would wiggle her nose and things would happen. But what were they doing? They were desensitizing and programming us to think that was cool. And then one of my kids was Sabrina, the teenage witch, which was even better. And then I would say in the last 10 years, all of a sudden you started seeing a plethora of all of these not sitcoms, but they were series, they were shows that were put on TV that were all about occults and Wiccan covens and Charmed. And I can't even think of the one that I remember, but it was a bunch of kids who ran into the spell book only to find out then later down the way that their parents were too, but they made it look cool.
Well, Disney did Wizards of Waverly Place, I think, and there's all kinds of... Now that I'm thinking about it, really there were quite a few.
Oh yeah, so you watch it and you go, well, what's wrong with that? And
right.
Halloween time, we watch Bette Midler, Hocus Pocus. We've glamorized all this. Well, that show was not bad. It was introducing and formulating that witches is good.
Right.
It was changing the perception.
Right.
And then if you had any objection about it, you were the fuddy-duddy, the bad one, the one that, just chill out.
Right. What's the big deal? What's the harm?
But from there, we had that explosion. So America's turning from God, as I said, began manifesting in the 1960s with the sexual revolution and then the whole occult practices, but there had been another sexual revolution actually prior in ancient times. And that was in the Greco-Roman world.
Right.
This was not new. We're talking thousands of years ago. It was a revolution by which biblical and ethical standards, ideals, and morality actually replaced the pagan world.
Right.
That was when the gospel message went out.
Right.
So if you think about this, everything that we're seeing here is what used to be there, but what changed? It was the gospel message that came in that drove it out. But now
we've driven out the gospel
we've driven out
message.
the gospel, and now we are getting full circle what they used to have. It happened when the gods were cast out of the Western civilization, casting out of Venus, casting out of Aphrodite, Astarte, Ishtar. Imagine that. And I think of I could not help but think of John Wesley. If anybody knows his history, he actually started the Methodist movement, but that's how it started. He started preaching the gospel message in Europe. And he went into those slum areas. He went into the areas where people were caught up in prostitution and gambling, and they were drunk, and so the family was torn down.
Right.
There was no money, it was squander, it was terrible. Mm-hmm. And so he came in with the gospel message, and it changed everything. They started cleaning up their act, they quit drinking. Well, if they weren't drinking, then that meant they weren't going to the bars. Mm-hmm. They weren't putting their money there. If they were staying home and not doing the prostitution, well, then the brothels were now hurting.
Right.
If it was a trickle effect, and then when they were home, the family unit got better. That's why it was called Methodist, because it was a new method for living.
Sure.
We're a far cry from that too, aren't we?
We are now. Yeah, we are now. We're back to where the community was before John Wesley got there, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So if she would come back, what would it would mean that those pagan sexual values would now be replacing and overturning the biblical ones. So we're switching back. We have rebranded what was moral as the new morality. It's technically not. It's the old morality. It's an ancient one of the gods. And that was the aim of Ishtar, was to destroy the morality and the faith by which she was expelled. So she's mad, and she's coming back with a vengeance.
That is right.
So to do this, she would have to take over a Christian nation, a Christian civilization, and destroy the morality, destroy marriage, destroy the sanctity of life. But it can't be done all at once, just like we talked about last time, step by step and little increments. She was known for her powers of seduction and spells. The words of Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, her ancient spell, she would begin the seduction of America and the modern world.
So what has that influence looked like? It's looked like the deterioration of marriage.
Oh, absolutely.
And when did that really start coming into play?
In the 60s.
60s revolution. Now people not even wanting to get married, they just live together, because why even bother with a piece of paper? Why even marry with being settled down?
That's right.
Just live together. Mm-hmm. With her, you see what you would expect. Sex outside of marriage.
Right.
That's what she is all for. The effects of that particular thing, chemically, emotionally, and that's a whole host of things for a different episode.
Yeah, it is.
What it looks like when God created man and wife as marriage in a family unit, and when that is not done that way, it wreaks havoc with a lot of things.
It does. It really
People don't
does.
realize. And then you have increased unwanted pregnancies, which then increases abortions. It's just a trickle effect.
Right, absolutely.
Which then, with her, we look at what? An uptick of
prostitution, and then sex trafficking, child trafficking, pornography, nudity about any kinds, commercials. It doesn't matter. We talked about this a little bit last week. It doesn't matter what you're trying to sell. You could be selling insurance, you could be selling shoes, you could be selling anything, literally, and they make it about sex. They sexualize everything. Sex sells. I mean, they talk about that in advertising.
Yep.
And it's no longer sacred, and it was meant to be sacred and set apart by God and happening between a man and a woman in a marriage, and she's taken that and defiled it.
I think she's made it bad. She's made it filthy. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, it's the butt of jokes, and it's never good. It's disgusting, or it's raunchy, or that's not what God designed at all. Well, think think about Tina Turner. When did this come out big? Probably the 70s. What's love got to do with it? But a second-hand emotion.
Right.
Now, is that what God created in the garden and called it good?
No.
No. Well, the spirit of Ishtar was led only by her will and desires. She had no regard for consequences of her actions. The idea of denying her desires was not even heard of.
Right.
And she sought the immediate fulfillment of every impulse.
That's 100%. Every child.
Does that sound familiar?
Sure does. Because there is no delayed gratification. There is no, with anything, I'm not going to save up for what I want. I'm going to put it on credit so I can have it today. There's nothing that we do that we feel like we need to wait for or deny ourselves or do anything to
It's just
make it
what I
worthwhile.
want. Me. It's all about me.
And I want it now.
Yep. Yeah. American and modern culture is consumed with that instant gratification, which has been toxic to our marriage. Because you take that attitude into a marriage,
Right.
well, then it just becomes selfish.
Right.
The family unit is starting to deteriorate because of it, and just relationships in general,
Oh,
just even
gosh.
friendships.
You can't have a solid relationship with any person if it's all about me all the time.
Well, and think about church too. I'll even bring that in. Church is no longer us coming to worship. And how sad is this? I mean, you have in a pagan situation, everybody went to worship the gods. They gave all of their time, all of their energy, all of their money to worship the gods. Who gave them nothing. And yet here we serve the Almighty God who answers prayer, who talks to us, who literally is real. And what do? We feel like getting up in the morning and going to church.
Or we fight about the order of worship, or we aren't happy with
moving furniture.
Yeah, I mean, any of it. We get so tied down with it's not how we've always done it, or I don't want to worship with them because they're not, my denomination, or just any of
Just
the
even
above.
the attitude of giving is so different.
Oh, absolutely.
Which we should be the opposite.
Absolutely.
And you're not seeing that. Well, what about Ishtar or Ashtoreth, whatever name you want to call her, Inanna? What about that in Hollywood? We started a little bit with Bewitched, but what about the movies?
Oh my goodness. That has changed dramatically.
The attitude.
Yes.
I mean, what it started out with in the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, even a little bit in the 60s, and then how it started changing in the 80s. What happened in the 70s and the 80s was soap operas. That was during the day, but in the 80s at night, it was soap operas at night. Dallas was the first one, I think, that came about. And Falcon Crest, and I don't remember the other ones. Hotel, maybe. I don't remember. That wasn't part of it, but I remember the folks watching it. But all of a sudden now, see how that was creeping in? You got into the homes, got into where the women were at during the day, get them hooked on it,
Right.
which was nothing more than soft porn, basically. And then now in the 80s, we're going to put it right into your homes at night, when the kids are there and they're watching too. And now look at, oh my gosh, it's just horrid.
What you can find on TV at 6 o'clock in the evening.
Any time of the day.
Oh yeah.
Because now everything's demand. I mean,
On demand.
you can go back, you can watch anything. Stuff the kids should not even be watching. Oh, it's just really right there. And if a parent, if you are not tech savvy and know how to put all these controls, parental controls and everything, but that still doesn't stop them from watching it at a friend's house or something like that.
It is so easy for them to get and to watch things that we wouldn't have even dreamed of.
Oh no.
No.
Well, so think about your great-grandparent. Someone who was living, that was older and living in the 1950s. Think about the shows that they watched and what they were influenced by. Even before I Love Lucy. I mean, we're talking the old stuff. Now, if they were shown one of the TV programs from today,
Right.
their minds could not even process it.
I remember there were a lot of times we didn't watch TV even when my grandma was around or came around, or if we did, it was game shows. You know, she liked Jeopardy and some of those. But there was so much that was like, we're not going to watch TV because we're going to be embarrassed by what is available on TV. And even, I can even remember thinking like some of the shows that we probably watch, we don't want grandma to see it.
But yeah, you were watching it. Yeah, well, okay, so it was 1947, you looked that up, when the very first TV show actually had, but they were man and wife, and they actually had one bed in the bedroom.
Right.
We thought Lucy and Desi were actually the first ones.
They were the second.
They were the second, where they put their beds together, but most of the TV shows had separate beds.
Right.
Even though they were married. Now look at what's going on. Oh my gosh, I mean, it's...
They're never married.
No. Yeah, they're never married.
And most of the time it's like, oh, it was the first date and we fell in love, so let's go upstairs. Yeah.
With Ishtar, not only was she the champion of sexual immorality, but she sanctified it. And she declared it holy. What was unholy, she declares as holy.
Right.
The sexual immoral acts were part of her cult and worship, performed as rites in her temples and her shrines.
How is this American culture's attitude towards this? Not only is immorality accepted, but it is treated as sacred. It is treated, you know, as women, well, we've arrived because we now are allowed to have sexual freedom and all the things that men were already allowed to have, now we have. It's not good for anybody to have that kind of freedom. It was never designed for that. If you try to go against the grain, you get shut down. You're ridiculed, you're mocked. It's as if treating it the way God had intended is what's wrong, and
exactly in this world, in this culture, you're made fun of.
You're prudish,
stoic. Yeah. But the spirit of Baal had begun. The spirit of Ashtoreth or Ishtar has taken to an entirely new level. The point is to destroy a civilization.
Right.
That's the whole underlying thing here. To start out with introducing it into the mainstream culture, then familiarity, then numbness, then toleration, and then next is acceptance, and finally celebrating it.
Yeah.
Think about that. I talked about the system a couple episodes ago. That we are fighting a system.
Yeah.
Okay, this is not just a system with like the World Economic Forum or a system with the people behind the Great Reset or the powers to be, the black cabal, whatever. This system goes all the way back to the very, very, very beginning. We've seen that. If you want to induce anything into a culture, what do? You get them familiar with it. You keep bombarding them with mainstream. And right now we have 5 companies that own all of the media.
Right.
All of the media. And them, even within them, they own stock in each other. Right. So they're all interconnected. So whatever they want to push, that's why you see it on TV, you see it in movies, you see it in magazines, you see it on your phone, you see it in the stores, you see it, and wherever they can advertise, you're going to see whatever they're pushing.
Right.
So then you start to get familiar with it.
And just like we talked about last time, and just like we said, if your great-grandparents were shown a show today that's on, they would be absolutely horrified. But what happened, and we just slowly moved the line of what was okay, and we slowly moved it, and we slowly moved it, and we slowly moved it, and now all of a sudden the door is wide open and we're willing to accept pretty much anything.
Because if not, then we're considered the bad ones. They've actually used, as I've said, Christianity against us. Well, that's a lot to look at with this one entity, but she's big. In fact, she's probably one of the biggest players of that dark trinity.
Of the 3.
And the problem is she does so much destruction, and she does it with people that are willing participants.
Right.
Because she's all about desire. You know, almost think of Pinocchio on the island, you know, do what you want and enjoy your life, and, you know, there's no consequences.
Right.
There is no morality anymore. It's only immorality that's now the new thing.
Right. And it's dangerous, and it destroys individuals, and it destroys families, and it destroys communities and cultures, and all the way up to the civilization, because the very core of how we are to, and even relationships, we talked about that, you know, if all of that becomes, I'm the only one that's important, I'm only in it for myself, and whatever I want is what I'm going to go for, and the entire culture is like that, well, look around. The majority of what we say, that's enlightenment. That's no. And if you look around the world that we live in right now, this is the result of everything being about me.
And letting that door be wide open.
Oh, absolutely. Because then we hardly have a line anymore.
That's right. There is no more line. We just keep kicking it down the way.
Because even things that are happening today, I guarantee 10 years ago, if we had told you or shown you, so much of the country would have been in outrage. Oh my gosh, we could never let that happen. But now,
I wouldn't even say 5 years ago.
But now it's like, well,
what do you expect? It's the 2000s, 2020s.
Right, it's the modern world.
Yeah. Well, I think we definitely, after that, need some joy.
We do.
So I think it's time for
Joy break. For today's joy break, I have just some funny little one-liners. So before they invented drawing boards, what did they go back to? Does the Little Mermaid wear an algae bra? How do I set my laser printer on stun?
There you go.
How is it possible to have a civil war?
Oh,
that's a good question. If all the world is a stage, where exactly does the audience sit?
And I want better lighting. And 10 pounds less.
That's right. If love is blind, why is lingerie so popular?
Ishtar.
I was gonna say, we might have answered that one. Okay, so this one I think is hilarious, but I also feel bad for laughing. If one synchronized swimmer drowns, do the rest have to drown also?
I think my mom used to say, so if your friends jump off the bridge, would you drown too?
That's right. If the number 2 pencil is the most popular, why is it still number 2?
That's a good question.
This is a good question.
Because when you're second, you try harder at it.
Oh, there you go. If you're born again, do you have 2 belly buttons? No.
No.
If you ate pasta and antipasta, would you still be hungry?
I bet the calories would.
Just cancel each other out. I like it. If you try to fail and you succeed, which have you actually done?
Interesting.
Why are hemorrhoids called hemorrhoids instead of asteroids? And why is it called tourist season if we are in fact not allowed to shoot them? And if the black box flight recorder is never damaged during a plane crash, why don't they make the entire plane out of that stuff?
That's a very good question. That would be the smart person that would do that.
That's right. So then I have one little funny story. 2 college roommates got together at a class reunion after having not seen each other for many years. When the topic of conversation turned to family, the one lady said, "My first husband was a banker, but he died at his desk one day adding his debts and his debits and credits. My second husband was an actor, but he ran off with a showgirl. My third husband was a minister, but the Lord called him home shortly after we got married. Now I'm married to an undertaker. 4 husbands. A banker, an actor, a preacher, and a funeral director. That's a rather eclectic group, her friend remarked. Yes, said the lady. I married 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go. That's right. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
now is the time when we talk about
What do you do with that?
So this is the portion of our show where we're really going to dive into all of the things that we talked about in the meat and potatoes section. Why do you care about that? Why do you need to know? And how does it apply to your life? And
It's a big one.
it is a big one. Why should you listen? Why should you care? And there's so much that we talked about today that is impacting every aspect of our lives. And this one is important.
Well, and we didn't even scratch the surface.
Right.
There is no way that we could even begin to get into really the heart of this entity and this deity. But what I would highly suggest, and I guess, yes, I am plugging Rabbi Jonathan. I love how he put it into this package that makes it very easy to read.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Anybody can understand it. But he gives the specifics, the dates, the names, the
Return of the Gods.
I mean, I
It's
knew this
no
stuff
way that
before,
man-
but I could have orchestrated this. There is no way that anyone could have made this up or tried to make it fit. And yet, everything has.
Well, and there's nothing new under the sun.
That's right.
It's all a pattern that is repeating itself, and when you see all of it, it's like, oh wow. It's hard to deny when you can just see all those things all lined up. And like you said, there's no way the majority of the people involved in these different moving pieces had any idea, but there are entities and things that know and are pulling the little puppet strings.
Well, and we said it was that movement from that tolerance to just go along with everything to then celebration. And we've seen that
Absolutely.
on a lot of fronts, on
Oh,
a lot
100%.
of different issues. Things that were considered an abomination of all sorts to God, and now we're celebrating all of it.
Yeah.
It's a totally radically different, we would say for us, approach, but it's not
No.
in the world standpoint. I mean, this has happened in other civilizations. That's why we keep bringing Rome and Greece into this, because that's what was going on there. That's
Right.
what was going on in Babylon. That's what was going on in the Canaanite realm. Again, this is not new. So while it may have seemed like we spent a lot of time maybe talking about sex, but that's what this goddess uses as a tool
to
to
destroy.
worm their way in. That's right. And it does. It destroys everything from the family unit to our thought process to growing people up way faster than they ever should. I mean, I'm not saying that people have to wait till they're 30 to get married, but if you look at the Hebrew culture back then, they did not get married, for men at least, until they were about 30. And it was that leave and cleave, and we're going to look at this more when we get into the family relationship stuff. But
Right.
what that does chemically to your brain and the grooves that it makes, and it changes everything. So maybe for some of you out there right now, what are you struggling with? You're going, I just found out that my husband or my son or even daughter is struggling with pornography, and they don't know how to handle it.
You don't know how to handle it.
It's destroying things. Their attitudes have changed. The family unit has changed.
Our marriage has changed.
Maybe you have some insight from the mental health perspective. What could you say to the person out there who is married or living with someone who's struggling with pornography?
Well, it's 100% an addiction, just like any other addiction that we've seen. And the similarities are to the changes in the brain, the changes to the way a person experiences sex and has to have sex. I mean, it can really come in and destroy all of that. And so understanding it as an addiction, it's not something like, you know, if you were addicted to heroin, you wouldn't say, well, as long as I just have a little bit of heroin, or I just keep some of it on tap for a rainy day, or if I only have the good kind of heroin. I mean, the analogy can go lots of different directions, but it's something that has to be stopped completely and has to be treated in that way. A lot of times some counseling, therapy, that kind of stuff can help. Getting to the root of what is causing it. Oftentimes there's a reason that's probably, it has absolutely nothing to do with the person, with the spouse or whatever. It's that individual that has something that is missing or needing to be fulfilled. Or
well, and I think that's one of the biggest lies. We're talking about the deception right here.
100%.
So one of the biggest deception is if somebody's struggling with this, then the loved one who's caught in the wake thinks that there's something wrong with them,
100%.
or they're not attractive anymore, or they're lacking, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you 99.9% of the time.
Well, and that's where it comes in and tears up the marriage, because that person feels that way and then is responding accordingly. And then the person who has the addiction, no, that's not it at all, but that's the message you're sending.
That's the message, and that's what you're always feeling.
Yeah, words and actions aren't matching in that one.
Right. Well, and this particular entity wants nothing more than to destroy a marriage, a family unit. And there's so many other temptations out there besides just that. You know, I said she's a god of war, and that's part of it. How do you win at a war? You divide.
Absolutely.
You divide and conquer. And so you start with a family unit. You start right there with the man and wife team. You divide them up, and then it's so much easier to conquer, put people into a hopeless and helpless state. But that's not where we're called to live.
No, not at all.
You know, I was looking at the different aspects of all of this, and you know, Paul, this is not new. Paul was dealing with this when he was going out, when they were sharing the gospel. They went to Corinth, they went to Galatia, they went to Ephesus, they went to Rome. I mean, all these different towns, and they were worshiping gods and goddesses. So what Paul was preaching, that we needed to live in the world, not of the world. What did that mean? Well, when he went to these places, he's preaching a radical new concept,
Right.
a radically new, different morality, but he was still living there, but he was not partaking.
Right.
You know, what is the saying? When in Rome?
That's not the way Paul did it.
Exactly. That is not what he was doing.
And that's not what we are called to do.
Right. But that's what's changed in this nation. We are Christians living in the world. But now we're starting to do just like those other Christians of Corinth and Galatia. They're like, well, we like Jesus. We're on fire now for this gospel, but we miss our other stuff, like temple prostitution or whatever. The things that make us feel good, or me going out and getting drunk. I don't know what all the different things were that they did. But Paul is talking, he's like, no, you can't do that. That's why he's constantly telling people that, you know, you need to stay away from sexually immoral things, but you can't be idolaters, meaning you can't worship God and carry around your idol to Zeus. And you can't do that.
Right. And while we might not do that exactly, but you can't worship God and not be willing to put your phone down. You can't worship God and not be willing to put someone else before yourself every now and again. You can't worship God and, well, I have a lot of extra and I'm just going to save that for a rainy day, even though I know that there's people that are in need and that are hungry and that this or that. So many different things. We can't worship God and do all of that and keep other things, because where your heart is
where your treasure is. Where your treasure is where your heart is.
Right.
So Paul has a whole long list, multiple times throughout the scriptures, of things that we're supposed to refrain from, because as Christians we are called to be apart.
Right.
And that, again, he was constantly admonishing them, telling them, no, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
When you accept Christ, you become a new creation, which means you have to live
A new way.
But what are we doing here in America? We're doing the reverse then. We were the new creation, we were the new Christians, and now we're trying to bring in, and we're justifying it with, well, the rest of the world is doing it, or what's so bad about it, because we've dealt with it. When we were talking about the pornography, and that's what Ishtar's all about. She started this way back when. And look at the statues.
If you look at some of the statues from,
it was all about nudity. It was, and they called it art.
Yeah.
But that's really not what she was about. A lot of people, and you've probably heard this, and maybe you've been one that said that, and it always kind of bugs me. They always say, well, God will never give you more than you can handle. That's not scriptural. Nowhere in there does it say that God will never give you more than you can handle. Because if you could handle it, you wouldn't need God.
That's right.
But what it does say in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, he says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be enabled to endure it. So that's what it is. It's not that God won't give you more you can handle. God will never give you more temptation than you can handle. Because
without providing a way.
Yes, we live in the world. You're going to be tempted.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be times when you're going to fail and you're going to fall to that temptation. But the difference is we can always go and ask for forgiveness and start again.
Mm-hmm.
Because sin is sin regardless of what it is.
Right.
When God says don't, and we say, no, I'm going to do it, it's all the same.
Right.
The difference is, unlike these entities, these little gods of the world who required so much, they could not offer forgiveness.
No.
We are the only ones that serve a God who does. In fact, he didn't just offer forgiveness. He loves us so much that he did what no other God would do. He sacrificed his own son on the cross. And that blood is what sanctifies us, is what brings us into the fold. When you accept Christ as your Savior, Jesus said, I am the only way.
No one gets to the Father.
I am the truth and the life.
No one gets to the Father except through me.
That's right. The world will tell you a lot of different things.
Yes.
The world will tell you there's a lot of ways to God. Scriptures are pretty darn clear.
Right.
About how to get to God.
Absolutely. And talking a little bit about sin, and all sin is the same. One of the things that I guess really is important to me as we talk about all of this is what another way that they've used to divide us, and another great deception is that it seems like either you have to be open and affirming and accepting and celebrating all of it.
Everything.
It doesn't matter what it is. Everything
comes up.
Or you're a Christian and you hate everything, and you think you're better than, and you're judging.
Hypocritical.
Stoic
and old-fashioned and out of touch.
Right. That's not reality either, and that's not where we want to be. Because we're not called to judge, and we're not called to think that we're better than anyone, because sin is sin no matter what it is. But that doesn't mean that we have to be accepting of all sin, and especially if it's scriptural that this is laid out, this is what sin is. But there's this middle road, and I really like, because I feel like Paul did that and showed us that example of going and being admonishing, which for us would be encouraging people to read the scriptures and reading with them and praying about it and digging in. We talk a lot about not just reading it, but do your research.
Right.
And
not just the Bible. Yes, read the Bible, but there's going to be things in there like we're talking about. When you go, I've never heard that before. Well, you got to do some extra research. What were they talking about? Doesn't mean that the Bible's not true or all there. The problem is, it was written for a group of people that were living in the culture and knew the culture. guess what?
We
We're
don't.
not the culture. 2,000 years later, we have no clue on some of this stuff, what they were even referring to.
So the knowledge base of the readers of the Bible, when it was written, it was expected that they would know things. So then there were things that they referred to that were just like, that doesn't make
an
sense.
extra biblical text.
Oh, absolutely.
The Jewish people knew those extra biblical texts.
Mm-hmm.
They knew what Josephus was. They knew what Enoch was. They knew what the Maccabees. They knew what some of these other ones are. We don't,
Right.
for the most part. Like people have not read it.
Right.
So when it's made reference to, oh yeah, they know exactly. But we're sitting there left scratching our head going, what does he mean by that?
Right. So digging into those extra biblical texts.
Well, and this is where you get into those discussions and sometimes those arguments, hot and heavy. One that I hear all the time, the different things with Leviticus, it talks about women are not supposed to wear braided hair with like the gold through it and stuff. They read that and they go, oh, women aren't supposed to wear braided hair. That's not what it was referring to. Some of those rules were in there for the very specific thing we just talked about. The temple prostitutes braided their hair in a certain way and they put the gold strand through it and some of the other things and the way they covered their head. It was so that way if you were walking down, you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt who that person was and what they did. There was no guesswork.
Right.
What they're saying is don't do that.
Right.
Don't look that way. Don't wear that because that's not who you are. You are set apart. You can't wear your hair in braids.
Right. But they knew that, so they understood not the letter of the law, but the heart of it.
Right. The problem is we look at it now and we try to apply some of that stuff into our lives now, which
It's hard to do.
Yeah, it works and it doesn't work. It just depends. It's the whole concept
behind it.
of it.
What it means, what it meant to them, and what we can take that to mean for us today.
Mm-hmm. So when you sit there and you go, how does this apply to us? There are things that are right in our faces that have been there all along that we have been oblivious to. We're talking about culture things. If you don't know the culture things, you wouldn't know.
Right.
So these different entities have different names depending on the nation that they're with, the culture they're with. Well, with Egypt, a lot of it always goes back to Egypt.
It does.
With Egypt, Baal was Osiris, and his sister wife was Isis.
Yep.
Osiris gets in a fight with his brother. This is the story, the legend. His brother kills him, chops up his body in 13 pieces, and throws it into the Nile. His sister wife, Isis, goes in and retrieves 12 of the pieces. The one main missing piece is the phallus, which then she cannot get pregnant. So she makes this magical one somehow. Okay, here's the thing. If you look at that, that sounds like a really weird and an odd story, and why would that even matter? Okay, look at Egypt. Every time you see a phallus, which is the tall structure with the point at the end, that is representing that. And it's never by itself.
Nope.
There is always a reflecting pool, which would be what they thought is portal. And then on the other side was the pregnant dome of Isis.
So some sort of building that had a rounded dome.
Yes. All right, so I want you to think about this then. Let's bring it up. Where else might you see that besides Egypt? Rome. You have the phallus, the obelisk, which is sitting right there in the middle of the Vatican. I've always asked why.
It's a good question.
Why is that there? And what does it face? St. Peter's Basilica, the dome.
Right.
There's another place. Well, most of the mosques
Oh, yeah.
are a lot that
a lot
way.
of mosques are that way. They have
Most
both.
of them, yeah. But then America. Now that I've just said that, what comes to mind?
Well, the Washington Monument
Washington Monument is the obelisk.
and the reflecting pool.
The reflecting pool is in the middle, and what's on the other side?
The Capitol.
The Capitol.
And it has a dome.
And it has a dome. And there's so much more to that than that. Again, that is scratching the surface.
But it's
at the bottom of the Capitol and stuff. I mean, yeah,
it's just out there.
Works with Egypt. Yeah, it's there. Whether we know it, whether we acknowledge it or not, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Right. And did the people who put that together, the individual, architect and all that stuff, probably not even a clue. They just thought, oh, this would be a great idea, or wouldn't it be pretty to have that as on, But what it stands for and what it symbolizes for our nation is a whole different story.
And that's kind of what we looked at last week with the gentleman who wore the bovine hat, who went in and didn't just go in the Capitol, but did something very, very important. Went and sat in the chair behind the desk. Mm-hmm. Did he know what he was doing? Not in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Right. And that it doesn't have significance to these other entities.
That's right. So, we've given you a lot of stuff to chew on.
Mm-hmm. And just to let you know, if you are sitting there going, what in the world? Just know that probably, 2 years ago is when I would have started this journey. A year ago, if I'd heard this, I would have gone, what? But I was hungry, and there were things that I was hearing that resonated, because there were things that I was seeing in the world and feeling a part of and believing, and then things that I knew were scriptural, and they were not matching up. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance that I chose to ignore. And so for me, it was like, okay, wait a minute, there's some nuggets of truth there, so I need to dig in. And so I did. I spent a lot more time in prayer and reading the Bible and reading other books and reading other resources, and that's why I'm sitting here today, because I want everybody to have the opportunity to know. And just, if there's any part of this that you're just like, oh wow, okay, I need to know more about that, I encourage you to reach out to us.
And I am far from knowing everything. And people say, how do you know so much? Because I study. I read, and don't just take it off of Wikipedia, or from one source, because it's always going to be slanted. You need to pull from a bunch of different sources. Mm-hmm. And when you start hearing the same stories and it's resonating along the same lines, then you go, okay, and pray about it. Pray about it, because it will settle in your spirit when you know what you're hearing is the truth.
Right.
And that's what this whole vodcast and this ministry is about bringing the truth into a world that is being fed a solid, steady diet of lies and deception, and getting at the core of where that deception is coming from, because we want nothing more than for healthy families.
Oh, 100%.
And for healthy Christians who have a steady diet of the Word. Mm-hmm. Because once you know, you can't unknow. So before we leave today, again, this may also leave you feeling like you're in a very hopeless state or a helpless state, because you're looking at everything going on around in the world and you go, what can I possibly do that's going to make a difference? It can feel that way. But sometimes God is not calling us to change the world. He's just calling us to change ourselves, our perception, and in return, sharing that which can change your family. And you can share that with your neighbors, and your family members, and your friends, just step by step. Just know that we serve a God, and we know the ending. We know the ending of the book.
Right.
While these entities are making a big comeback and we've allowed them in, does not mean that our God still is not sovereign, and He knows what's going on.
Right.
He knows exactly what's happening, but He also knows the end game.
That's right.
And as Christians, we do too.
Spoiler alert.
Our hope is in the God we serve,
Right.
the God of salvation.
Hold on to that. And when you're needing light in what can be a lot of darkness, just know that Yeshua is there.
Yeah. And as my shirt says, sometimes you gotta just stir up the waters.
That's right.
Well, if we're doing our job right, hopefully we've done a little stirring in your soul as well. So until next time. Bye.